Okay, today we are starting week 6. So this is our second actual week of moving forward. We're going to wrap up World War I. I know we're not covering a ton of the stuff that we feel like we should, but we're going to cover the main points in order to get a basic understanding of the war. We'll talk about it more next year in U.S. history as well, so just keep that in mind too. So today we're going to talk about not specific battles so much, we'll reference a couple, but the different areas where fighting was taking place. So we're going to talk about the Western Front, which is one that we normally think of when we think of World War I in the trenches. We'll talk about the Southern Front, which they didn't really call it that, but fighting down towards the Balkans, kind of where the war started. We're not going to reference so much fighting in the colonies, even though that did happen quite a bit. And then we'll talk about the Eastern Front and how that's going to end earlier than other places. Then we'll talk about the U.S. entering the war at the very end, so not too much to talk about with them. And finally, how does the war end? When does it end and what happens? We'll talk about the treaty and after the war next week. We're just going to get to that actual end of the war and the armistice today. So some of the stuff we're going to cover today, you'll have read it in your reading. Some of it will be new. There's quite a bit of just kind of hodgepodge, like random information. So listen, add new notes if you need to. And if none of this is new, then great. You don't need to take any notes on it. Just listen and see if you can pick anything up. So the Western Front, which we know is going to be where the trenches will eventually be, they're not there yet, they're going to start right about here, are going to be between Germany, when Germany heads over through Belgium to France. Germany will almost make their way to Paris, and that will be called the First Battle of the Marne. So this is going to be September 1914. Now, if you remember the Schlieffen Plan was Germany's master plan to quickly go through Belgium into France, capture France, so then they could focus all of their attention on the Eastern Front against Russia, knowing they didn't have the resources to maintain a two-front war. So they'll successfully just go through Belgium, which will bring Great Britain into the war, but not until a little bit later. And they'll push their way into France, nearly making their way into Paris. Now, if they had captured Paris, that might have been the end of the war. It might have been over. They might have been happy with that. Who knows? But they are going to be pushed back by the French people to the point where we are fighting within miles of Paris. There are more men needed at the front, and we will have hundreds of French, Parisian taxi drivers actually load up their taxis with French troops to drive them out to the front to get there quicker. Now, when the French meet with the Germans, what they'll end up doing is, because we have much more effective, you can see right there, the long rifles, they're shooting at each other across this open field. And so you'll have one group that will start to dig down a little bit to hide a little better and just be able to peek over. So the other group does the same thing. That's the picture on the right. They'll dig down a little bit so they can peek over. And each group will dig down. Now they begin to dig north, hoping to get to the North Sea before the other group in order to get resources or to get to the Navy. And that is called the race to the sea. So we're going to dig trenches facing each other all the way to the North Sea and the Channel right across from Great Britain. So we can look right here at this picture, and you can see the blue is the French, the red is the Germans, and those are them digging their trenches. Takes them nearly a month to get all the way up there. And you can see Dunkirk there. That'll come into play in World War II, but still that's where the Allied powers are going to end up, in these thousands of miles of trenches. Now, we're not going to talk about any specific battles, but we are going to talk about one of the worst battles and influential battles of the war, and that will be at Verdun in February of 1916. So the war's been going on for over a year now, and this is going to be, you can see the red, those are the Germans. So this is going to be a German offensive, and you can see right in the very middle, it says Verdun, the river's right there. The Germans will attack, trenches are dug in, fighting will go on for 4 or 5 months, and it's a stalemate. Neither side can push back. The French are nearing the end of their rope. They don't have much more to hold them together. And at this point, by the time we get to July, both sides have lost 300,000 men just in this one battle. So someone needs to come to the aid of the French before they give up this key position, and that would be the British. So the British are going to launch the Battle of the Somme, and we can see on our map right there, it's just going to be north on that kind of race to the sea of Verdun. And this is going to be an attempt by the British to pull German troops away from Verdun to allow the French to recover. So the British will launch an offensive hoping to pull Germans away from Verdun. Now, this battle will last several months, and in the end, it will be even worse than Verdun with nearly 500,000 casualties on both sides. When we look at kind of this period from February to November, with nearly 2 million people dead in the combo of these two battles, what was won? What was lost? The Germans at Verdun, you can see that little red spot right there. They gained nearly 4 miles. So think of when you walk the track, how much or how little 4 miles is, because you're having to move in those trenches, so you're not able to move very much at a time. So they will gain 4 miles in nearly a year of fighting. The Somme, the British will gain just over 5 miles, and that's that little purple spot right there. So this is just an example of the epic death toll without much gain or much loss because of trench warfare, because of advanced technology, poison gases, snipers, flamethrowers, and those kind of things. So this is just one example of how that turns out. So we're going to skip that and look at some of the outcomes and where that came from of this war. So you can see in this, the picture on the left is trenches. Those are all bodies at the end. On the right, that's no man's land, a fence line. In the middle, we have some disfiguration due to fighting, and how are we going to deal with that? And one of the big things that happened because of advances not only in technology but in medicine, a lot of people that would have died during earlier wars were able to survive just with missing limbs or with deformities or what have you. And so you can see a picture right here. These are men missing part of their legs that are going through like an early form of physical therapy to try and get back into normal life. And that brings us to the trenches. I said we we're just going to jump around to a bunch of different topics today. So I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures of the trenches. You should have already watched the video, or you will watch the video on Tuesday about life in the trenches. So none of these topics should be new. I'm just going to run you through. We talked about the daily boredom. Most of the day is spent sitting. So what do you do when you have to sit in a trench like that for hours on end? Now, this is a picture of, this is going to be a British trench. The Germans, when they started building the trenches, kind of knew that this was going to last for a while. So the Germans initially built way better trenches than the British and the French did. So the British and the French had to deal a lot more with water. So only in the early, they'll develop better trenches as we go on. But we talked a little bit about trench foot in the video. You can see how that would happen. Imagine if that was a hot tub and you sat in there. For days on end, what would happen and how your fingers get soft, right? And as they get softer and softer, they start to peel away, and that's what trench foot is, and they start to kind of puff up. So trench foot is like the extreme version of that. So you can see how that would happen if your feet are constantly in that water. And here we're inspecting for trench foot. Those are British troops with those helmets. And there are trenches, and here's no man's land. Good vocab word to know, that middle land between the two trenches. All right, so let's move to the southern front. So again, not normally called the southern front. I just like to think west, south, east, not really too much fighting up in the north. So if we look down here, we can see Turkey, where the Ottoman Empire is. Here's Bulgaria, and this is kind of that Balkans area. So what's going to happen in the southern front is Winston Churchill, who was in charge of the Navy during World War I, is going to come up with he thinks, brilliant idea to capture the Dardanelles. So now we've just zoomed in on this Ottoman Empire, and you can see where Constantinople is, and the little strait right there, the Bosphorus Straits. And then you can also see from the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean, the Dardanelles Straits right here. So Churchill's plan is to bring from Great Britain the British Navy all the way down through the Mediterranean Sea, and they're going to come up here, and from the Ottoman Empire, who are their enemy, right? They're going to capture the Dardanelles Straits. They're going to move through into the Black Sea, and once they're into the Black Sea, they will be able to resupply Russia. And that will be an easy route to get Russia supplies so Russia can continue to fight on the Eastern Front, because Russia at this point is struggling. So they're going to do it. They take the British Navy. He's in charge of the Navy. He gets to make the call, February 1915. Now, the interesting point about this is because of where we're going, we're going to bring a lot of Australian, New Zealand troops with us. Remember, those are colonies or part of the Commonwealth with Great Britain. And French troops will also be involved because it's kind of a big mix. And we are going to be stuck at the Dardanelles. This is going to be a massive failure, a massive loss for the Allied powers and for Churchill and the British Navy. They will never make it through the Dardanelles. They will barely make it to land on the beach. It is so bad to a point that one of the British naval ships is actually captured by the Ottoman Empire, and they will use it throughout the war, sailing under the Ottoman Empire flag. So in the end, by the time we get to December, this has been called a stalemate because they can't beat the Ottomans. The Ottomans can't beat them because they're on ships and they just go back. And so we're stuck. Churchill will be fired. And in a cool twist, he will end up enlisting in the army and becoming an epic part of the army during World War I, and then later go on during World War II to become prime minister. So he kind of has a really cool story if you ever want to look more into him. Really good movie. The Darkest Hour, more about World War II, but Churchill in his later years, and they reference Gallipoli a lot. So even going, 30 years later, people will be like, we can't trust Churchill because of Gallipoli. So it sticks with him for a very long time. So that's what's happening in the South. So that brings us finally to the Eastern Front. We can look right there at the Russian Empire and that line that separates Germany and Austria-Hungary from the Russian Empire. Now the Eastern Front is going to be Russia and Austria versus Hungary, Germany and the Ottoman Empire on the bottom there. So they're kind of having to fight at two different areas. Now Russia has a lot of things, and this is what happens in every war. Russia has land, right? They have people and they have winter. Never invade Russia in winter. No one ever seems to figure that out, right? The Germans have advanced technology, more well-trained soldiers, and better leadership. So who wins in this battle? It's going to take a long time to figure out who's going to win, because when you have a lot of land and you have an unlimited source of soldiers, you just keep replenishing them. So no matter how good your technology is, if the people keep coming, you can only kill them so quickly. And Russia is willing to sacrifice its people for that. So, and this is a great test question, opposite from the Western Front, where we get bogged down in trenches, the Eastern Front is constantly moving. Because of the terrain, trenches are not really a thing that they're able to use. And so we are constantly moving forwards and backwards and up and down and all over the place. And we have several instances where we'll surround entire cities and try and starve them out, and that won't work. And so then we'll do something different. So the Eastern Front is very different from the Western Front. So again, we can see a picture there. Excuse me. So in March of 1917, the Tsar, Nicholas II, the one with the crazy wife who's being kind of told what to do by the religious guy Rasputin, will be overthrown. Now, in an effort to try and rally his troops, Nicholas had moved his camp, basically his headquarters, to the Eastern Front, to like the front line of battle, and left his wife in charge of the government. Bad move. She is of German descent, so they think she might be a spy. She has this weird holy man Rasputin who is in her ear all the time, kind of telling her stuff to do. So between the Tsar up front not being really in control and her in charge back home at the capital, it just leads to disaster. So he is overthrown. We have this first revolution, and the government that takes over says, hey, we're going to stay in the war. We're going to stay committed to our allied friends like we said we would. But then just a couple months later, in October, Vladimir Lenin comes back and seizes power in a second revolution that will be known as the Bolshevik Revolution. And this is when the communists will take over, and that's that red revolution in Russia. The first thing Lenin does once he's in power, signs or agrees to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which will give Germany a ton of land along the border and take Russia out of the war. So at that point, Germany is able to pull all of their soldiers and move them and focus them on the Western Front. So they're going to be able to add all those soldiers to the Western Front. Now, the only thing is you're like, sweet, they're just going to like jump over there. No, they have to march by foot from the Eastern Front at the Russian border all the way across over to the French, Belgian, German border um, to fight. So that's going to take quite a long time. They're going to be really unhappy. They're out of food by this point. So the German soldiers, by the time they get to the Western Front, are not going to be the happiest of campers. And that brings us to 1917, when a bunch of different things are going to happen. So if we look at these, the very first one, you can look at these and kind of see what's going to happen. We just talked about this. The German troops are going to shift to the Western Front. Second thing, and something we haven't talked much about, is the British naval blockade. One of the biggest things happening in the waters during World War I is German submarines and unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, if you can see where Germany is getting blocked off, the British Navy, that red line blocks Germany from getting any supplies in. So Germany's only retaliation is to use their submarines and begin to attack any ship they see in the water, hoping to block supplies from getting to Great Britain. So to try and even the playing field. The only problem is with submarines, you don't know what you're hitting. You don't know what you're attacking. They don't see you coming. So if you hit a non-military vessel, what does that mean? Now, several years earlier, Germany had been accused of sinking several U.S. ships, or ships that had U.S. supplies and people on them. And so they had come to an agreement that they would warn people before they sunk their ships or before they shot at their ships. Now, if you're a submarine, that gets rid of your entire purpose. If you can't shoot them without warning, then there's no surprise. They can shoot at you. They can defend themselves. So for quite a while, these German submarines, these U-boats, had been kind of useless. But now in 1917, knowing that they kind of need to step up their game or they're going to run out of supplies, they begin again unrestricted submarine warfare. And at one point, they sink a U.S. ship bringing supplies to Great Britain, or selling supplies to Great Britain. And so what does that force the U.S. to do? Okay, at the same time, we have fighting ramp up in the colonies. So you can see the picture on the right. We're in Northeast Africa. On the left, we're farther south. We're going to be in Southeast Asia. We're going to be in the Middle East. So fighting is happening all over the world. We also have technology ramping up during this time. So you can see he's wearing the gas mask. We've got machine guns getting faster, getting stronger. You have poison gases getting more effective. And tactics like this, they're just not working anymore, right? Things are crazy and people are dying at a much higher level. We've got trenches, we've got trench warfare, we've got poison gas, which we'll talk about in another video. You can see the evolution of gas masks. You've got tanks. And one of my personal favorites, Fokker's synchronizer gear. So one of the big things, one of the reasons that airplanes weren't used in fighting was they were unable to shoot a gun without knocking out their front propeller. So with this, there was a piece of metal that would connect the machine gun trigger with the propeller, so it would circle at the same time, so it would fire in between. So you were now able to use a machine gun on an airplane, which turns it into a weapon. So that completely changed fighting in the air and led to a lot of dogfights and planes being a lot more effective as a weapon. All right, so we're starting to sink U.S. ships. And then you can see this right here, subs sink 7 U.S. ships, and we have the Zimmerman Note. The Zimmerman Note was a note written by a German diplomat in the United States to the Mexican government, saying, Mexico, if you declare war on the United States in order to distract them so they don't enter war with us, with Germany, when the war is over and we all win, you can get back Texas and Arizona and New Mexico and all the way over to California. So that's intercepted by the British. They give it to the Americans. That combined with the sunk ships, the U.S. declares war in April 6th of 1917. Now, the U.S. isn't ready for war. They declare war in April, but it's going to take quite a bit of time for them to gather their troops, gather their stuff, get them across the ocean before they can actually be useful. And if you have seen anything on the war, you know it's going to end in 1918. We're halfway through 1917. The U.S. isn't going to join the war until the very, very end. But they are going to provide that final push of enthusiasm, of supplies, of fresh troops that the Allied powers are going to need to win the war. So what does this mean? This becomes, and these are just some key vocab words that should have been in your book that you want to plug in if you don't already have them. This is going to become a total war. And that means it's the conflict in which every aspect of society is mobilized in the war effort and helping out. So you have, this is the second one here, people are rationing, as in regular people are limiting what they have to make sure that the military has enough. You're doing rubber drives where everyone goes and drops off tires so we can melt them down and use them to create, for tires for Jeeps over in the war. We are not eating meat on Tuesdays so that the soldiers can get more meat. So rationing will be a big piece. Propaganda also plays a big piece in that, where everyday people are being sold on the idea of you as a winner, you as a good guy, and the enemy as an evil, trying to keep morale up. So let's look at a couple of those. You don't have to take any notes on these. It's just interesting to see how everyone was portrayed by each other during the war. So this is a German propaganda. So obviously he looks like a man, father. You can see in the background there his family. You know he's German because of the helmet. He's got that point on there. That is something only the Germans would do. You can also notice it by the language, right? This is towards the middle of the war. What about this one? So we still see that helmet. That's a German, but now how is he being portrayed? Who do you think this propaganda, what country do you think is creating this? Now, we'll know that this is the US for the war saving stamps. That's something that the US did. The British did something very similar. Okay, what about that one? Now this one, I don't know if it says, but this could either be a British or a US. You've got the Navy in the background. You've got the naval fleet, and this goes along with that rationing. Okay, what about this one? This is kind of a fun one. So the helmet on the ground there, it's got the spike, so we know it has to be. And who's dog peeing on him? Look at the hat that he is holding in his mouth. And that's a Red Cross puppy, right? So Red Cross trying to save. Who's the Red Cross helping out? That is a French military top right there. Okay, what about this one? Oh, this is a good one. Should be able to tell by that hat, but it's kind of interesting. So this is actually an Australian poster, right, who's part of the British Commonwealth, so they will come to the aid of Great Britain. All right, so this is going to bring us to the end of the war here. So what happens? In the end, we know that Russia is now out of the war. So Germany is going to begin under Ludendorff their German spring offensive. This is their last major push. They're like, all right, we got all these guys coming in. We know the Americans are coming, so we're going to be screwed if we don't hurry up. So we have to push through, and if we can get through, we got it. Otherwise, we're done. So obviously, this is going to be spring of 1918. They begin a push, and they will actually capture some spots, but they start to get bogged down a little bit, and right when they're starting to get bogged down, that's when the Americans come in. Now, the Americans are not ready. They're not properly trained, but they are enthusiastic. They are well fed. They bring supplies, and they bring people. And that will help the Allies. So the Allies will begin to push back against this German offensive, and that will begin the Allied powers' 100 days offensive, which will push them all the way to the end of the war, into that line when we are going to sign that armistice. So at this point, we know that we're done with that. So that will bring us to the Black Day of the German army. And this is when Ludendorff, who had led this push, this German spring offensive, will recognize that the Germans are beginning to surrender en masse. Morale is lost. All is done. All is over. And he will call that the Black Day of the German army. And that is kind of the signal that the war is over. Now, we haven't officially laid down arms. That'll be the armistice here in just a couple days. But you can see here the pink spots is where Ludendorff had been able to push out in the spring. But then we'll see the Americans on one side, the British on another, will help to push back. The Americans, especially here down in the south, you see where Verdun is, they're going to push back through an area known as the Argonne Forest, which will come into play in World War II as well. And that will be their one major offensive. That is basically the only big battle they fight in this war at all. But it is part of the last major offensive, so they're considered a big player. They are considered kind of that big push that will get the Allies the win. So on November 9th, 1918, 2 days before the end of the war, the Kaiser Wilhelm, he will abdicate, meaning he will give up the throne. He will run away. He'll survive, which his cousin, Tsar Nicholas, did not, so bad news for him. And Germany will be declared a republic. Now, what does that mean? Not good for them. They're not going to really be able, well, we'll see what happens with the Treaty of Versailles. That'll come up in just a little bit. But 2 days later, on November 11th, so the 11th month, the 11th day, at the 11th hour, they will ring the bells again. The lights will go back on, and the armistice will begin. And an armistice is not a peace treaty, it is a laying down of arms. So it is like this in between time where we say, okay, war is over, we're going to lay down our arms, lay down our weapons, but we don't actually have a treaty yet. So that's when we talk, if we get to that, about North Korea. North Korea signed an armistice. So they laid down their arms, North Korea and South Korea, but they never actually signed a treaty. So technically, they're still at war. They're not fighting, they have an armistice, but they're still at war. So we'll sign an armistice on November 11th, and then we will meet a couple months later in France, in Versailles, at the Palace of Versailles, to create the terms of the peace accord. Now, this, just an interesting piece moving on to World War II, this railroad car is where we will bring the German officials, the Allied powers. We will meet on this railroad car to have the Germans sign an official, we lost the war, right? Now, the interesting part is when we get to World War II, Hitler, when he goes into France and takes over France, will make the French leaders go to this exact same railroad car to turn over France to the Nazis. So Hitler was big on making up for mistakes or losses in World War I. That's why that Argonne Forest will become important there too. That's going to be another Hitler play on World War I. So that brings us to the end. Next week, we will look at the Treaty of Versailles. We'll also talk a bit about the Spanish flu, which will come about in this time, which is really topical considering why we're having to do this all on video. All right, thanks you guys.